For KOSU, I'm Michael Cross, and it's time for This Week in Oklahoma Politics, along with Republican political consultant Neva Hill and civil rights attorney Ryan Kiesel. The EPIC Virtual Charter School Board votes to increase transparency in the hopes of halting termination proceedings. Under reforms, EPIC's Learning Fund will be transferred from the for-profit management company governing the school to EPIC itself. Neva, do you think this will be enough to save EPIC?
Well, I think there's a lot more that has to occur before we know the end of this story, and I think this kind of 11th hour Hail Mary attempt at a settlement, which we don't know how that's going to be received. I think the indication was that they would see how close they were and what the terms of concessions were going to be. So a lot of questions. I think clearly with this looming May 12th and 13th two-day trial date set, that seems to be the thing that's pushing on all of this that's occurring this week. So we'll have to see. It's as we've said many times over many months, this is such a complex issue with so many parties involved. I mean, the Attorney General's office, the State Auditor and Inspector, attorneys for EPIC, the statewide virtual charter school board, all of these entities. So it's going to be a fascinating story as it continues to unfold.
Ryan.
Well, and this only addresses a small part of a very complex picture. And so, even part of me wonders if what they're trying to do here is to not settle out the entire dispute, but to try to take something off the table. They see that they've got 2 days, and so maybe the items and issues in dispute, if they can narrow that down before they get to their 2-day trial, that might be advantageous to one or both parties to be able to focus in on some of the more complex issues. I mean, we have an auditor's report that's hundreds of pages whenever you total everything together, that have a number of allegations in them. This just is one of them. I mean, I think that they recognize that they're in trouble. Settlement is always good. The other thing that, and this is kind of a novel idea, maybe if I were EPIC, I'd come to the table right now and say, in between now and this trial date, let's try to mediate this thing. And mediation is good for a lot of reasons. One, to come to some resolution and settlement, but also to narrow the issues. And that's rather than trying to do it on your own, if you have an independent third-party neutral mediator there, they can really help narrow some of these issues. So if the board that hears this trial isn't going to budge on whether this is going to be a 2-day trial, mediation in the meantime might be useful. We'll see. I think that it's doubtful that this standalone settlement offer ends everything.
And I think you're right. I think there's so many pieces to this. I mean, last fall, the Attorney General's office, when they the released investigative audit came out, they said that there might have been violations to state laws, and that the contract terms for the management side might have issues with good cause. So that's one thing. EPIC has been in district court trying to keep the release of their Learning Fund spending records from the auditor and inspector. That's been a big fight. A lot of questions related to how the monies have moved from these different entities that EPIC has. And so there are so many unanswered questions. I mean, the audit raised a lot of issues, but now we'll see whether these are brought to light in the courtroom or in some mediation or out-of-court settlement.
And if I were on that board, one thing that would be a line in the sand for me would be EPIC's continued actions to avert transparency. As long as they're trying to hide the ball on money and numbers of students or on any information that they are currently in court trying to hide from the state of Oklahoma and the state auditor, if they won't put that on the table, there's no settlement out there that if I were on that board that would be that would satisfy me, because ultimately, these are taxpayer dollars, and these are the students of these are Oklahoma public school students, and we have a right to transparency there. If that's not part of a settlement agreement, I don't think it goes anywhere.
Well, and I think you're exactly right, Ryan. I mean, when you look at some of the issues, the $200,000 plus what was considered an improper transfer from EPIC's Student Learning Fund account that went to pay a payroll shortage in their California charter school, EPIC's California charter school. I mean, big questions that the auditor and inspectors raised, and I think all of those still have been left largely unanswered.
Tulsa Public Schools joins a growing list of districts filing legal action against the State Board of Education. This all stems from the board settling a lawsuit to, in essence, provide equal funding for charter schools as public schools. Oklahoma City Schools has already called for an injunction against any reallocation of revenue. Ryan, do these schools have a case here?
Absolutely, absolutely they do. I mean, I think that central to all of this is whether or not the State Board of Education had that authority to allocate funds as part of a settlement in a way that goes against the state constitution and goes against state law. I think that is a very strong argument that every one of these school districts brings to the table. Of course, there are also procedural arguments about whether or not there was enough notice, the type of vote that was taken. Should the board have had that authority to act when it did? Mm-hmm. Those are questions in and of themselves. But I think the actual authority of being able to transfer dollars out of brick and mortar schools and put them into virtual charter schools or even charter schools themselves, brick and mortar charter schools, raises enough questions that this will definitely have its day in court unless we see the legislature step up and provide a resolution before this happens. And we saw, last week we talked about legislation that had been introduced that would take money from the medical marijuana allocation to the state's Common Ed fund and use that to fund brick and mortar charter schools, but not virtual charter schools. Mm-hmm. Even the bill's author said that has a long ways to go between now and the end of session at May. But I think everybody would probably prefer a resolution like that rather than roll the dice going into court.
Neva.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, the school districts that are stepping forward on this issue, I mean, Tulsa, Oklahoma City Public Schools, and then Skytook, Owasso, and Jinx, which largely have said through their attorneys that they kind of support this action, but not necessarily are directly involved. But what about all of the other school districts across the state of Oklahoma? I don't see this large kind of swelling up of a support, I mean, behind these large public school districts in trying to advance this through court action. I think what many say is it remains to be seen that the 4-3 board action it may or may not whatever is construed as having been proper in terms of the allocation of the funds. The point remains that they did have the right to settle a suit, and so I think the fine points are what have to be worked out. And I think in this instance, we're seeing really the same players on the statewide scene, supportive of the state superintendent. I mean, these are some of the strongest allies of Superintendent Hoffmeister, who have sided with her in this instance where the vote did not go the way that she had intended.
Well, and you do start to see some school districts that don't sponsor charter schools stepping up and getting into the fray here, and they recognize that, well, we might not lose money immediately out of this. This might not take money out of our coffers immediately, but if you begin to take money out of the Common Ed fund in general at a state level, it could have a funding effect on school districts whether or not they fund charter schools. So that number of schools may increase as superintendents and school boards begin to realize that even if they're not playing in the charter school market right now, that it could have an effect on their bottom line.
I would think if they had been able to rally a number of other districts right up front, that would already be happening. And at least at this point, there doesn't seem to be that indication of that broad support statewide, but rather in these large metropolitan school districts seem to be the ones that have really come to the forefront quickly.
The state Republican Party elects former lawmaker John Bennett as its new chairman. The controversial selection of the former Sallisaw representative was criticized by several groups, including Oklahoma's Council on American Islamic Relations. During his time in the legislature, Bennett repeatedly attacked Muslim Americans. Neva, what do you think of the Republican Party's choice in picking Bennett?
Well, I think we have to keep it in perspective. I mean, both the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, as they come together to elect their state chairs, vice chairs. I mean, they're officials that are involved in the party organization statewide. It's a very different. It's a very different proposition than people running for statewide elective office or people involved in other elements of the party, actively involved with candidates and other organizations. So I think in this instance, we had a competitive race. We had 4 people running for state GOP chair. John Bennett did win on the first ballot over the 3 opponents. He's someone that during his time in the legislature, there's no question in the House, he was a lightning rod. He liked to tune it up. He knew how to get the rhetoric going. Sometimes that doesn't serve all parties well, but in this instance, I think we have someone who takes the reins of the organization in terms of the grassroots 77 county organization, and will head that up for the Republicans. And he's someone that from a profile beyond what you just described, someone who's a retired combat Marine, someone who is currently a pastor, someone involved and long time involved in Republican Party politics. So not a surprise that this type of candidate is successful running for this type of office.
Ryan.
Well, I think that there are a lot of words to describe it. I think sad, embarrassing come to mind. But, I would also say that, it reflects a fundamental fight within the Republican Party for the soul of the Republican Party right now. Following Donald Trump's 4 years in the White House, there is a real question as to who the leader of the Republican Party is. The folks that show up at a party convention, and I've been to a lot of Democratic Party conventions. They represent a core of a party, but they're not the only core. I mean, the core of folks that show up at the Republican Party convention, there are people that are just as conservative, if not more conservative or conspiratorial, that wouldn't ever step forward into a banquet hall at a hotel and participate in the convention. And so, there are real divisions within that party. We saw it when when one of the chairmen for the party had to stand up and preface Senator Jim Inhofe's speech at the Republican Party convention, saying that he expected them not to boo because Senator Inhofe apparently, wasn't vociferous enough in his opposition to voting to allow the electoral votes to be cast for Joe Biden to become president. Kind of the same thing with Senator Langford. I mean, he's got a primary opponent from the right because he switched from protesting the certification of the election results to casting a ballot to certify the election results. And, that's a real fight within this party. And I said that there are different constituencies. Some of those constituencies are in leadership. You saw some of that from Jim Inhofe at the convention saying, I know folks might not want to hear this, but this is what you need to hear. But you also need to hear that from legislative leaders. And it's, if you don't want to be defined as a party by your chairman, you don't have to be. But then it's incumbent upon you as Republicans and Republican leaders around the state to stand up and call that out whenever you need to.
And I think both parties struggle with this kind of evolution of party activists on both extremes. Coming to these types of conventions and being engaged in trying to, select leadership. And you're right, Ryan. I mean, folks that vote every time, every election, folks that give their dollars to candidates they believe in, folks who go out and knock doors, folks who are engaged in the process at other levels may not necessarily be the same folks, the 1,200 plus delegates that were at the Republican convention this past weekend, or who will be at the next Democratic convention. So I think we have to keep a perspective that in this age where every delegate and every person who ascribes to a party affiliation wants to engage in giving their opinion, they certainly have multiple opportunities through social media, and I think we're seeing that more and more. And I think that is changing the grassroots activism as it always does, cycle to cycle, depending on which party's in power, both in Washington, D.C., as well as here in Oklahoma.
Right, and while it might not seem that important to our listeners, why care about the chairman of the GOP? It has been a springboard for several of our, Matt Pinnell, Gary Jones, all went on from being the GOP chair to other elected offices. So it could actually mean something fairly important for a future of the elected officials.
That's true. I mean, we can see examples where you could argue that it was a springboard, but oftentimes those folks have already had a profile, have already had a statewide presence, even before they became a state party chair or vice chair. So that's not necessarily the prerequisite, but it certainly is something that does elevate a profile, does give them an opportunity to make statements. But again, I think those statements are not always reflective of the membership, just like we could say that about any national organization or any state organization today.
You know, Senator Inhofe said that it was difficult for some of the members of the convention to appreciate what he was trying to say and what he was trying to do and what he tried to do with his vote and his voice in the certification of the election results and in the lead up to the insurrection at the Capitol. And you know, I think that he was probably genuine in that to some extent, but the reason it's so hard for people to understand what he's saying is that leaders like Jim Inhofe and Senator Langford and Representative Mark Wayne Mullen and you can just kind of and John Bennett have given legitimacy and credibility to the most outrageous and at times dangerous conspiracy theories about the last election and some of the other moments of recent American politics. And so it's incumbent upon them to change that. If they give credibility and legitimacy to that, they shouldn't be surprised whenever their constituencies, whether they're sitting at home on Twitter or coming to a convention to vote for a party chair, they shouldn't be surprised whenever they see the most extreme elements rise to the top.
The NCAA issues a warning to state lawmakers over a bill to ban transgender students from participating in sporting events in public schools or universities. The organization's board released a statement in essence saying if it would withhold all events in the state if the legislation becomes law. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this threat?
Well, I hope that they hold true to it. If we in Oklahoma pass one of these bills, and we see them all around the country. And these bills aren't about trans kids playing in sports, just like the old bathroom bills weren't about trans kids going to the appropriate bathroom. They are about exploiting a political moment against a marginalized group of individuals. And on one hand, it's wonderful that we live in 2021 and we can have these very important and nuanced conversations about gender and sexuality and what all of those things can mean to an individual's self-identity and self-expression. Those are just, what wonderful nuanced conversations to be able to think about ourselves and our friends and our community. But often those conversations are run in the face of a lot of dogma, and that dogma is centuries old. And it's backed up by some very powerful forces, and you see politicians exploit that, and that's exactly what we've seen here. The NCAA, if you look at a group that ought to have a stake in this, they've come forward and said they have a very thoughtful process as to how they are going to incorporate trans people into sports appropriately and safely. And it's an ongoing conversation, and that's what this needs to be. And really, what we see here is a piece of legislation that's meant to directly target trans kids for political points. And hopefully, this threat, which if this passes, I doubt it's a threat. I think they'll follow through on it. Hopefully, the NCAA stepping up here would be a loud enough megaphone to get the legislature to step off this bill.
Neva.
Well, I think that when you look at the fact that Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee governors have already signed similar bills into law. We've got 30 states looking at it, Oklahoma being one. This is not. This is something that's being twisted. I think it is more about being a pro-female athlete bill. It's more about saving women's sports and allowing for the opportunity for there to be the competitive athletics. And when you look back, this is something that has become an issue. It was talked about last fall. There were congressional resolutions that were put forward. So this has been a broad discussion taking place across the country. But when you have people, I remember Martina Navratilova, 18 Grand Slam tennis singles titles. She said that sex segregation, when she was asked about this some months ago, that it was the only way to achieve equality for girls and women. And she made the point, and I think many are making the point, that all you're doing with the discussion of trying to move this direction and not have these sex-specific athletic teams is you're reducing the opportunity for females. Female athletes and really women's sports altogether can be largely threatened. So I think this is trying to draw too many things into one basket, try to confuse the public, which I think by and large the broad sentiment is let's keep what we have in place. We've done well to bring about women's sports, bring it to the forefront. Title IX, many things that have occurred through time that have given girls and women the opportunity to excel in sports, and now to kind of blur this line and move this other direction. I don't think there's going to be broad public sentiment in Oklahoma or across the country for this type of action, and I think the NCAA, while they do have an obligation to make sure that there is an environment for, as they describe it, safe, healthy, and free of discrimination, that's one thing. But to move this direction and take on this discussion with the threat of taking away the opportunity for teams to come into states like Oklahoma, play softball, other championship tournaments, would be highly regrettable.
Lawmakers introduced legislation to help protect Oklahomans from astronomical bills from February's winter storms. The bills provide extra time for utility companies to recoup their losses from the event and recommend pulling expenses into larger bonds or loans. Neva, do you expect these measures to make it to the governor's desk?
I think they will, and I think what we saw is a very quick, very concerted, and excellent effort on the part of all parties, with these lawmakers initiating this legislation to really deal with something that could have been tremendously burdensome on everyone in Oklahoma. When you think about the average gas bill being about $100, and then the projection said that it could be approaching $2,000 a month over 6 or 7 or 8 months. The impact on families and singles and folks all across Oklahoma, businesses, would have been just unsustainable. And so I think coming up with this ability to have the ability to come up with these bonds, to move this direction, to spread this out over a longer period of time, to have the not only put this into place, but have the structure in terms of the Corporation Commission involved and the other oversight agencies involved, I think makes it a very certain and a very well thought out proposal. And I applaud all the parties involved, because I think this is a case of where you had a problem, you needed a very quick solution, and they all got together at the table, hammered out the details, and at least from all appearances on the upshot of this, they've done a fine job.
Right.
Well, and you talk about all the parties involved. Senator James Lee Wright, I doubt that when Senator Lee Wright started this legislative session, that he thought that this was going to be the lion's work that he would take on, and he really has. And he's led a lot of these conversations and negotiations, some extraordinarily complicated. Just reading the solution to me kind of makes my eyes glaze over, because I'm hoping that it works. But good on them for coming together to help Oklahoma ratepayers here, because it would be extraordinarily debilitating for a lot of Oklahoma families. I think a second part of this, and there's obviously the immediate urgent need of what do we do right now to make sure that Oklahomans don't get bills in the mail for $1,000 or $2,000 that they needed because we're not talking about comfort here. We're not talking about cooking with gas and heating up some macaroni. We're talking about keeping your house warm enough to live in. It was a life or death situation here, and so people weren't out there jacking up their thermostats just for the heck of it. This was the real thing. So how do we keep people from having $1,000, $2,000 bills just for that? But then the second part of it is, we need to recognize that we live at a moment where the climate crisis is upon us. I mean, it's not some distant thing in the future. We are going to experience more devastating, more extreme, more unpredictable weather events moving forward for an unknown period of time now, and they're probably only going to get worse. And so, the state of Oklahoma should really know what were these providers doing in the run up to this. We saw these forecasts for a very long time. I mean, a lot of these groups have their own forecasting divisions. I mean, they're not just watching Emily Sutton on Channel 4. Mm-hmm. They're also watching, they've got their own people that they hire internally to do measurements and forecasting. Did they know about this? Did they buy enough in advance? Were they caught off guard? Those are real questions, because we can't do this again. A bailout of this nature, we can't. If we have another devastating cold snap at the end of this year, beginning of 2022, what do we do then if we're caught off guard? So the second part of this conversation needs to be about preparing for next time.
And I think the other thing that we need to take into account in the preparation is the fact that in Oklahoma's case, we weren't like Texas. We weren't like states where literally they didn't have the resources. They had not bought the billions of extra dollars worth of energy leading up to what was happening very quickly, and to be able to keep energy flowing throughout the state. So I think that it's like any instance like this where you're dealing with a disaster. It is important to prepare, and I think what we've seen is that the attitude of being more proactive, even beyond what has been true in the past, I think is a good indication that we're going to have folks with all hands on deck looking at this going forward.
Aniva and Ryan's comments do not necessarily reflect the views of KOSU, its staff, or management. Programs like this are made possible through support from KOSU members who are listeners like you. Consider a gift to KOSU in support of This Week in Oklahoma Politics at kosu.org.